Today's episode contains some material and language that might not be suitable for everyone. Discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Plum Forest Podcast, where we give you modernized versions of classical Chinese fables and short stories. Before we get started, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, or even leave a comment, because it lets me know that you're listening, and I like that. I hope every single one of you guys are staying safe in this weird situation that we found ourselves in, but we're all in this together, so stay as safe as you possibly can. Today, we got another strange story that was actually one of the first ones I wanted to translate when I originally read it. This story is about a farmer and a very strange man he meets when he's trying to sell his crop at the local farmer's market. It's got deceit, showmanship, lies, wisecracks, and even some wisdom that they can impart to the listener. This story was originally based off of Pu Songling's Growing Pears story, or in Chinese, Zhongli. It's a great story with many translations and most of them are good, but this is one of my own personal versions and it's adapted for the 21st century. If you're new to the podcast, which I bet most of you are, these stories can be pretty strange, so be sure to keep that in mind and have an open mindset because who knows what could happen next. Just a quick reminder that some of these places and names are real, but the story is 110% fictional. Well, on that note, let's begin today's story, The Apple Tree. On a blistering summer day in southwestern Washington, a farmer had just reaped his season's apple harvest and was preparing to head to the local farmer's market to see what he could get for them. He loaded his harvest of freshly picked apples into his dark green pickup truck with its brand new wood sideboards. Boy, was his truck a real beaut. As he finished loading his harvest into the truck, he decided to grab an apple and try for himself.
God damn it, these might be some of the best apples I've grown so far.
The farmer then hopped into his truck and headed to the local farmer's market down in the city. He soon arrived at the farmer's market and parked his truck at the same stall he's been at for years. He was quickly then ambushed by homeless people asking for free food. It was just another Saturday.
Get out of here. Get.
Many of the homeless left with the first shooing, but one in particular was persistent and wouldn't budge an inch. The farmer increasingly raised his voice and swore at this man to the point of nearby people covering their children's ears.
Aw, come on, man. You've got a bazillion apples in your truck. I can't even have one.
A crowd started to form around his truck as soon as their voices rose, and others were quickly joining in to see what the commotion was. As the commotion between the two of them got louder and louder, the mob of people slowly started to side with the homeless man to try and give him an apple. Even one of the bruised ones would have been enough to get him to stop harassing him. But the farmer stood his ground and sternly refused to give away an apple. These were the best apples he's ever grown and would fetch him a real pretty penny. After the crowd continued to argue and plead with him, a nearby police officer came over and handed him $1 for an apple to give to the homeless man. The crowd roared and cheered for the police officer, and the homeless man went over and thanked the man profusely. The homeless man promptly turned around and broadcasted out to the crowd.
The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. Can you believe this? Let me provide the crowd with the tastiest of apples.
You have your apple, man. Get it and get on your way.
I only wanted an apple for the seeds inside to feed the masses.
Not a millisecond after finishing his sentence, he devoured the apple in just one bite.
You ate the whole fucking thing? Even the fucking seeds?
The homeless man glanced over at the farmer and spit a single apple seed into the palm of his own hand. He then reached over for his sack and pulled out a small shovel where he dug a hole in nearby soil and planted the seed.
Does anyone have any hot water? It's gotta be hot though.
The crowd had grown in size over this whole debacle, and an elderly woman in the back pushed her way forward and decided to give up her warm water bottle. He tested the water temperature to see how hot it was by pouring a few drops on his hand, and after a quick decision, he poured the hot water out onto his newly planted seed. Every single person in this crowd had their eyes fixated on this tiny patch of soil to see what was going to happen. All of a sudden, a small sprout popped out of the ground, and everyone in the crowd gasped with amazement. This little sprout grew extremely quickly, and in a matter of just a few seconds, the sprout had grown into a full-fledged tree with twigs and leaves. The newly grown tree kept growing until it grew to over 8 feet tall, and the branches started growing apples that were ready to be plucked right on the spot. The homeless man, who knew exactly what he was doing, began picking off these amazing apples and handed them out to everyone in the crowd, even the little kid in the front row.
Thanks.
The apples were all picked and handed out to every person in the crowd, and everyone was amazed at how tasty these apples were, and they were even more amazed at how fast they grew. The homeless man reached back into his sack once again and pulled out a hatchet and started to chop the tree down. The tree fell to the ground after a few more whacks and nearly fell on a few members of the crowd, but it didn't faze anyone because they were all amazed by the apples and how fast this tree had grown. The homeless man looked around at the crowd, grabbed his sack along with the branch from the fallen tree, and threw them both over his shoulder as he departed the scene in a relaxed gait. As he walked away, he had his belongings over his shoulder and tossed an apple in his hand with no worries and his head held high. The crowd watched this man take his leave, but everyone was still amazed at what they had just witnessed. And they all got a free apple out of it that tasted amazing. The farmer, who was now part of the crowd of this peculiar situation, turned around to look over at his truck when he noticed something was gone.
Motherfucker.
The farmer's truck that was stacked to the brim with these tasty apples had vanished. Every single apple was nowhere to be seen. The farmer rushed over to look at his truck, and the crowd decided to follow him to see what had happened. His entire harvest was gone, and his brand new wooden sideboards were in a mangled mess. The crowd put two and two together to figure out that this homeless man had conned every single one of them, especially the farmer who lost his entire harvest. But they didn't really mind because they got to eat an amazing apple for free, and it didn't really affect them. The farmer stared over to where the homeless man was walking away, but he had vanished with no trace. Oh boy, I love the end of that story. I always remember the first time I read that story and I had to say to myself, wait, what? Turns out the homeless man was actually a con artist and duped the farmer out of everything he had. Pretty clever in my opinion, but someone had to win and someone had to lose. And I've always thought about how he got that seed to sprout so quickly. Must have been that hot water, right? Well, if you have any other questions about today's strange story, be sure to leave a comment or check out the discussion page on the Plum Forest Podcast subreddit. A special thanks goes out to my buddies Jake M. and Jerry Riccardi for helping out with the voices today. Thanks, guys. I am so glad that you listened to today's episode, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed making it for you. Please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button on whatever app you're using to listen to this. And don't forget that our website, plumforestpodcast.com, has more information about the original story along with some other cool bits of information regarding the story and the production process. Be sure to follow our Twitter and Instagram at plumforestpod for any upcoming information about future episodes. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to return next week for another episode of Plum Forest Podcast. You just listened to a Where's Kellen production.
Wow.